Michael Burns over at Wisecrack takes on Jordan Peterson in his understanding of Marxism.
Well, think again, sunshine.
And let's just say he watches a lot of Jordan.
Not just because I had to watch hours and hours of Jordan Peterson lectures.
But I don't think it's really sinking in. So I'll tell you, like Jordan said, maybe you need to do a little more.
Read more.
Today we'll see if Michael Burns is correct. Jordan Peterson doesn't know what he's talking about. We'll talk about that and more today on Indie Thinker. Welcome to the show. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget, we are knee-deep in one of the most important documentaries, I believe, of our time on the fatherlessness epidemic in America. If you want to see the full trailer for the film that we have at this point in time with Dennis Prager, Douglas Wilson, and Warren Farrell and others, then I highly recommend that you sign up for our newsletter. You can do that by going to the link on the screen. Not only will you gain access to great Indie Thinker content extras, but you'll also see the full trailer that we have at this point in time in our early stages of production, and it's fantastic. I'm telling you, what we have to expose in this fatherless documentary will help change the future of America, but we need your help to do that, because also by subscribing to the newsletter, you'll access ways to help support the film so that we can finish this thing and bring it to production so each and every one of you can enjoy it. So again, go to the link on the screen or go to the description of this podcast where you can find a way to subscribe to our newsletter where you'll gain access to the full trailer of Fatherless. Recently, Charlie Kirk made some comments about DEI.
Back of a plane, when the turbulence hits, or when you're flying through a storm and you're like, I'm so glad I saw the guy with the right stuff and the square jaw get into the cockpit before we took off, and I feel better now thinking about that.
No, I mean, like, you want to go thought crime? Like, I'm sorry, if I see a black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified.
That caused a lot of people to throw and hurl false allegations at him like this on YouTube.
This leads us to this salting Charlie Kirk.
Now, while that guy is absolutely a racist and definitely not amazing, I have to tell you, this kind of misrepresentation happens all the time, especially on places like YouTube and social media. It's far too easy to misunderstand the fact that Charlie Kirk is just simply saying that DEI disenfranchises people, because when you don't hire people based upon merit and you actually consider race and all these other things, that actually you're disadvantaging people. Now, of course, that kind of nuance is lost on a fool like I just showed you. But what I just said is the point. I try to be very, very careful, especially as a Christian, to make sure that I am not throwing around ad hominem attack. Sometimes I do it just to joke around. But I also want to be intellectually honest, and I want the best from my opponents, and I don't want them just to get emotional because they feel like they're being attacked and all of that stuff. So when I speak about people, or when I speak to people, I try to do it in a compassionate and considerate way. I also think it's very easy to try to attack people when they're not in the room. So when I level kind of the criticisms that I'm going to level today, I hope you can hear that I try to do it very carefully. So when I tell you that I think Michael Burns is participating in sophistry, I'm not really intending to say that this is a deceitful man, but I'm simply trying to say that what Michael does, like we saw with this other YouTuber, is what we see on YouTube a lot. We see people who just simply don't like an individual and then therefore try to paint him in a bad light. I think his rendering of Jordan Peterson, as you'll see today, is not entirely faithful and deserves a little bit of nuance. So that's why I'm responding to Michael Burns' response of Jordan Peterson when he was debating Slavoj Žižek on the subject of Marxism. So we'll go to our first clip.
Particularly, we're going to look at what happens when Jordan Peterson tries his hand at reading Karl Marx. Let's get into it. Okay, so to set a little bit of context, the video I'm going to use is from a debate that took place between Peterson and philosopher Slavoj Žižek. Now, the debate was meant to be about the question of communism versus capitalism, and as part of his presentation, Peterson tried to debunk Marx and communism via a reading that is solely based on the co-authored political pamphlet the Communist Manifesto. If you're not familiar with the text, it's a short work that was co-written with Friedrich Engels. Now, the aim of it was to be an accessible and concise text that could be read by workers around the world to aid in their understanding of the exploitation of the working class under capitalism and the necessity for a new political system. The manifesto outlines the antagonisms between two classes: the bourgeoisie, those who own the means of production and have access to capital, and the proletariat, the working class, who need to exchange their labor to acquire the means of subsistence. Okay, all that said, let's get into the debate, and we're going to pick up with Peterson introducing his argument.
I have to tell you, and I'm not trying to be flippant here, that I have rarely read a tract. Now, I read it when I was 18. It was a long time ago, right? That's 40 years ago. But I've rarely read a tract that made as many errors per sentence, conceptual errors per sentence, as the Communist Manifesto. It was quite a miraculous reread.
Okay, so Jordan Peterson doesn't like the Communist Manifesto. He came in pretty spicy. But my initial issue with this is it seems really weird to reference the Communist Manifesto as the sole text that represents Marxism and communism as a whole for the purpose of this debate. It's a text he co-wrote with Engels that doesn't really get at the whole of his economic and philosophical theories. So, there's two ways we can interpret this. One, and it's the good faith reading, is that this was an earnest attempt by Jordan Peterson to do his homework and debate the intellectual merits of communism and Marxism on their own terms, because he thought that this text was a good example of Marx's economic and philosophic theories. Or there's a more cynical reading, which is that Jordan Peterson is well aware as an academic that Marx's mature economic thought is located in other books like The German Ideology and Capital, and that in making the choice to avoid those texts, he can instead focus on a pamphlet that was written with Engels and doesn't really contain the fullness of Marx's intellectual arguments. And that's just something that kind of irks me throughout watching this debate, that I would like to see Jordan Peterson really respond to the fullness of Marx's ideas, and he doesn't. And because of that, you could say that a specter is haunting this debate. The specter of Jordan Peterson not doing his homework.
The debate up to this point has sounded a little bit like this. Karl Marx didn't just write the Communist Manifesto, so Jordan Peterson is being overly simplistic and misrepresenting the arguments of Karl Marx. Now, this is what I have to say about that. I mean, the book is called The Communist Manifesto. I understand it was written probably to appeal to a broader audience, and it's just, originally a pamphlet and was supposed to be an easy read, so perhaps it doesn't always package everything in the most exhaustive manner. But I mean, to say shame on you, Jordan Peterson, for looking at the Communist Manifesto and perhaps taking the crazy position that it serves as a distillation of Marx's ideas, I'm not so sure that that's totally out of bounds. Not to mention, when Michael rejects and refutes Peterson here, he doesn't actually show how the Communist Manifesto is being misrepresented. He's just slapping Jordan on the hand and saying, well, he wrote other things. So is that like an implicit acknowledgement that the Communist Manifesto is exactly what Jordan Peterson is saying it is? Well, let's keep on looking to see what other kind of wisecracking comments Michael Burns can bring to the fore about Jordan Peterson's understanding of Marx.
What struck me about the Communist Manifesto was it was akin to something Jung said about typical thinking, and this was the thinking of people who weren't trained to think. And he said that the typical thinker has a thought, it appears to them like an object might appear in a room. The thought appears, and then they just accept it as true. They don't go the second step, which is to think about the thinking. And that's the real essence of critical thinking.
Okay, so I find this really interesting because Peterson is implying that Marx, and in this case Engels, did not take their whole arsenal to the critique they're offering in this text. And this is a point where it seems like Peterson and Karl have a lot more in common than they realize. You could argue that Marx, in most of his work, is doing precisely what Peterson's talking about, right? Marx is analyzing the logic of industrial capitalism, which is assumed, or was assumed at the time, to be a good and logical system, and he's looking for internal contradictions and antagonisms within that system. When Peterson says, that you need to use everything in your arsenal to see if an idea can survive, it seems like he's describing what Marx is doing, and Marx called this ruthless criticism. Or in one text, the ruthless criticism of everything existing. Now here's Marx, and this is from a letter he wrote in 1843. Marx says, "Now philosophy has become mundane, and the most striking proof of this is that philosophical consciousness itself has been drawn into the torment of the struggle, not only externally but also internally. But if constructing the future and settling everything for all times are not our affair, it is all the more clear what we have to accomplish at present. I am referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of conflict with the powers that be."
So I'll be honest, the conversation, the response at this point in time gets a little tedious, especially when it's like Peterson was saying Marx was being simplistic, but Marx wasn't simplistic, you're simplistic, Jordan. And so all of that does get a little bit redundant. However, I think there's something important to note that Michael just seems to gloss over here. When he talks about ruthless criticism, he's not talking about the critical thinking that Jordan Peterson was just illustrating. Ruthless criticism clearly has a revolutionary element to it, especially as you get toward the end of Michael's definition of it. So yes, he's talking about attacking ideas, but then he starts talking about attacking something different. Marx says that we need to be willing to engage in conflict to overthrow certain people and certain ideas. So obviously conflict there within the Marxist milieu means something, and it means revolution. So this is a revolutionary criticism rather than a critical thought criticism. So this is very different than the kind of thing that Jordan Peterson is talking about. So I think the critique still stands as far as Jordan is concerned. He finds that, yes, the manifesto is a simplistic document that doesn't really engage critically in the subject matter that it hopes to either overthrow or support. Now, I don't know that Michael did anything right there to affirm the fact that that Marx nor Engels actually really engage in a kind of thought experiment that supports the claims of Marxism. And we'll see in this last clip if he can actually go one step further and prove that the manifesto does actually engage in a thoughtful manner the topic of communism and whether or not it should be supported. So let's check it out.
That's what you try to teach people in university, is to read a text and to think about it critically, not to destroy the utility of the text, but to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so what I tried to do when I was reading the Communist Manifesto was to separate the wheat from the chaff. And I'm afraid I found some wheat, yes, but mostly chaff. And I'm going to explain why, hopefully in relatively short order.
So I find this interesting.
I just have to stop for a moment and say, every time Michael says, I find this interesting, just assume what he actually means is the exact opposite, that he thinks Jordan is wrong. And the I thing just is absolutely annoying throughout the whole. So, and Michael, I think, runs the risk here of doing what we see very often on YouTube. I'm just going to say over and over again when you actually bring up legitimate criticisms because I guess just Marx studied a lot and Engels was smart. Again, I don't want to be seen as just supporting Jordan here just simply because Jordan is smart. But I have to tell you, at this point in time, I have not heard an argument that really digs down deep into whether or not Jordan Peterson is wrong about his assessment about the Communist Manifesto. So let's go to one final clip and see if he can make that case.
Because when he says, people, and it seems to be implied here that Marx doesn't go a second step to think about thinking. Well, Marx came up studying and eventually critiquing the philosophical work of Hegel, a 19th century German idealist. Now, Hegel and the German idealist tradition was focused on precisely this, right? Thinking about thinking, or maybe put differently, thinking about the possibility of the conditions of thinking. Idealist philosophy could be summed up as maybe the most detailed thinking about thinking in the history of philosophy. And Marx was well aware of this tradition. He studied it. It was included in his PhD dissertation. He wrote a book on Hegel. And Marx then turns this logical system on its head by taking the method that the idealists used to think about thinking and using it to think about history and materiality and politics. It's said that Marx, turns Hegel on his head by making that mode of thinking about reality and not ideas. And I don't know, I just think it's unfortunate that Peterson doesn't seem to be aware of that.
All right, this is where I have to tell you that I think Michael is verging into sophistry. So here's my problem with what he just said. Do we all pretend to know more than we think we do? Sure. But at least make an argument relevant to the topic. Not only is the way that Michael undermines Jordan's arguments a little peculiar, his main thrust is not that the Communist Manifesto is somehow a beneficial document. He hasn't argued that at all. And to really undermine Peterson, that's what he'd need to argue. In my mind, Michael does not prove that case. There may be ways in which Jordan misses something here and there, like we all do, but largely, Michael does not provide the evidence that Peterson has largely missed what he is saying. Not to mention, not a bit of this video proves that Marx was a critical thinker or that his communist theory holds any water. Besides, even if I'm wrong and totally missing the point, or I am like Jordan and I just don't know what I'm talking about, according to Michael, who cares what I think? History has already spoken. Communism has already been weighed in the balance by history, and it has been found a bloody mess of a satanic idea. For all the talk about Christianity and the Crusades and how many people were killed, you should know that 3,000 babies are aborted each day in abortion clinics, which has nothing to do with the topic. I just wanted to throw that in. But you should know that the bloodiest century in human history was the 20th century, and all of that was fueled by communism. And the death count for much of that lies morally and spiritually at the ideas of people like Marx. And what we get from its defenders is almost always, nuh-uh, communism hasn't really been tried. Well, maybe that's because every time it is, people die. So thank God that it hasn't really been tried. And to end on a positive note, I want to show one more clip.
Here's proposition number one. History is to be viewed primarily as an economic class struggle. All right, so let's think about that for a minute. First of all, the proposition there is that history is primarily to be viewed through an economic lens, and I think that's a debatable proposition because there are many other motivations that drive human beings than economics, and those have to be taken into account.
Okay, so Peterson's critical of the idea that he's reading the Communist Manifesto as making the claim that for Marx, history is primarily viewed as an economic and class struggle. And there's definitely truth to that. You know, what Marx is doing is reading history dialectically. Now, here's what Marx says himself in the manifesto, or Marx and Engels say themselves. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. But on the word society, there's actually a footnote in the text. And in the footnote, they say that is all written history. So, you know, the full line is the history of all written society is the history of class struggle. So, you know, Marx is specifying that he's talking about written history, largely European history. They also go on to say this in the manifesto. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. And almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. So in that quote, we see that Marx and Engels, while reading history as the history of class struggle and antagonism, are not always just breaking it down to binary oppositions. They seem to understand the complexity of those relations.
Okay, this is the closest I think we've gotten to disproving my point of sophistry. Here, Michael finally starts to make his way into a defense of Marx by saying that capitalism is not the only, but rather the most prominent iteration of class struggle, and Marx is using capitalism kind of as a proxy for the dialectical class struggle seen throughout all of history. But the problem is here, he's still missing Peterson by a mile. Peterson's claim is not that Marx is simplistic and he thinks that capitalism is the class struggle of every generation, past, present, and future. Peterson's critique is that the whole class struggle narrative of Marx is simplistic in any iteration it comes in. That life is way more complex and way more complicated than reducing it to class struggle in any fashion. That's the idea. So as a Christian, I could easily argue that class has little to do with the struggle of humanity, and actually faith is the biggest struggle. I could argue that the biggest struggle in mankind is the struggle between atheism and theism, and that it has nothing to do with class. From as early as the garden, we see the serpent trying to tempt Eve to be God so that God becomes unnecessary. Are we not seeing that same struggle today in society as people try to chop off their body parts to declare what their gender is? Is Marx not part of that same class struggle in that he was a satanic God-hating fool? So did Marx understand complexity within classes and steer clear of Peterson's critique? Well, who is the person who came up with the bourgeoisie and proletariat binary? Oh yeah, Marx. And Michael just got done saying that Marx's work was a critique of Hegelian dialectic. But if you study this, even on a surface level, you know that Hegelian dialectic is actually the way in which we take two competing ideas and show how they merge with each other. So the person who is actually fusing binary understanding to include nuance was Hegel. So if Marx truly is critiquing Hegel, well, then that might mean that Marx is being overly simplistic himself. But honestly, I don't really want to make any of those arguments because this is exactly what I see Michael doing throughout this video. He takes a tertiary understanding of German philosophy and history and qualifies it as a critique of Jordan Peterson. He never gives us a positive argument for the manifesto. Instead, he gives us goofy eyes and never undermines anything that Jordan Peterson says about the Communist Manifesto because, in my opinion, it's not defendable. I don't want to come off as seeming like I'm, again, purely defending Peterson because really this is more about the kind of sophistry that I see a lot in my line of work. You have a presuppositional bias in a Wikipedia article and all of a sudden you gain the right to tune out your opponents. You don't have an argument. You have your fingers in your ear, well, at least maybe one finger in your ear and the other one wagging them at other people so that you don't actually have to contend with their ideas. I guess all I'm saying here is sure, Michael is making a negative case for Jordan Peterson, but he doesn't make a positive case for the manifesto, and that's what he'd really need to do to one-up Peterson. If he can't truly make a positive case for the manifesto in its own right, and no one ever has, then you should probably sit back and listen to what Peterson has to say and consider his critiques, which I don't feel like was done at all in this video. And as hard as I try to stay away from personal attacks because they are not intellectual statements, and I hate it when they're lobbed at me, I'm going to be honest with how I feel. If you are still hanging on to any of Marx's theories in the manifesto, then you're a dork. Here's the cure for that. Do what Marx never did. Get your hand out of your jacket, get off your lazy behind, and get a real job, a wife, and kids. That personal responsibility will forge a brand new way of thinking that will change you for the better. I'll bet money that you might even come away thinking, who gives a damn about the manifesto? The Bible has a lot more wisdom to be unearthed that should occupy my time, and if I'm right, strangely, you'll be thinking more like Peterson than Marx, and for that, you can thank me later. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and go with God.